Amy Jo, this is Scott from the control room. It looks like your attendees are all present, so you can start when you're ready.
All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me today for a presentation on fire-resistant plantings, Firewise landscaping. Just a little housekeeping up front. If you've got questions, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A. You should have a Q&A box at the bottom part of your screen where you can go ahead and enter a question. And I will wait until the end of the presentation to answer all questions. So if you've got one, put it in there and we'll get to it at the end of the presentation. You should all be seeing the Firewise landscaping title screen at this time, and I'll probably stop my video as we start to talk here. So an overview on what we're going to talk about tonight. We're just going to do a really brief overview of fire behavior, managing fuel in the home ignition zone, and some resources that are available to you. And then I'll spend a little more time on fire prone and fire resistant plant characteristics, how to select those plants or not select them, a little bit on landscape design and maintenance, and then we'll actually look at some plants that are considered to be fire resistant that work well here in Central Oregon. So when I first started talking about Firewise landscaping a long time ago, actually I've been little introduction here probably before we get a little too far into this. I am the horticulturist for the OSU Extension Service, and I serve Deschutes, Crook, and Jefferson counties. I have area responsibility for home or consumer horticulture and some commercial horticulture. And I also manage and supervise the Master Gardener program for the region. I specialize a little bit more in waterwise gardening and fire resistant plants. So when I started to do some study and research in this, I used to collect the articles in the newspaper about the number of wildfires that I was seeing in the region and statewide and even on a national level. And what I found is as I started to accumulate some of these newspaper articles that I was just amazed at the number and the frequency in which they were showing up in the paper during wildfire season. What was even more concerning is when we were starting to see these wildfires turn up in urban areas and urban environments, not just in the wildland urban interface. So at some point I stopped keeping as close account on all the newspaper articles and have since just switched to one of the more informed websites where you can go in and get this type of information. So if you have an interest in this, this would be the website that you want to look at. The National Interagency Fire Center website will give you information. It'll break it down by state. It will break it down by number of structures burned, wildfire, acreages burned over the years. And so you can kind of get a sense of different stats if you have an interest in looking at that. This is an example from the 2010 Ashland fire. And this was somewhat eye-opening to me, at least, in that the fire started on one side of the highway. That's Interstate 5 there down the center of the screen that you can see here. And the fire started over here, but quickly jumped over the highway and in the direction of the wind. And unfortunately, 11 homes were lost in that wildfire and consumed by it. And that was the reason why those homes were lost was directly correlated to the plant material that was around those homes. You can see this is not considered to be a wildfire hazard zone area. And so it was unfortunate that it was strictly because of there being a fuel source available and the type of plant material surrounding these 11 homes. So to just give you a tiny bit of background information, These three elements, heat, oxygen, and fuel, is what you need to have in order for there to be a fire present. You take any one of those elements away and the fire goes out. So this is what is known as the fire triangle. This is what's known as the fire behavior triangle. These are the types, these elements, weather, topography, and fuel, all have the ability to change the intensity and the rate of spread of a fire. If you put the fire triangle and the fire behavior triangle side by side, what you recognize is that fuel is the common denominator between the two, and it's the one element we can actually influence. When I'm talking about fuel for our purposes, it's going to be anything that can burn. Trees, shrubs, grasses, and then all the structural things around a home that can burn and contribute to a wildfire. Fire can burn down a home or structure in three different ways: through direct contact of the flame to the structure or home. You can see that happening in this photo. Through radiant heat. And this is an example of a study that was done. This is actually part of Jack Cohen's research, where he was able to determine that radiant heat, the heat coming off of the wildfire, can start to burn a home from as far away as 100 feet. And this is what led to the home ignition zone being 100 feet or less from the home. And embers is the third way that a fire can begin with a home or structure. And this is actually the most common way we see homes being affected by fire. So we want to concentrate on ways to reduce fuel load and do our part to try and create that defensible space around the home. We can do that through modification of what's around the home, existing around the home currently, by adding fire-resistant plant material, adding fuel breaks, and using non-combustible roof and siding materials. For today's class, I am not going to focus on the housing materials. That's not the focus of today's talk, and we're limited on time. So I'm just going to focus on the plant material and design. So this is what's known as the home ignition zone. And you can see here, you have the home in the center of the screen. That first zone is called the immediate zone, and it's 0 to 5 feet out from the home. Ideally, in the home ignition zone, you don't have any type of flammable material, whether it be mulch, plant material, wood piles, in addition to what the structure is made of or built from. You don't want anything surrounding the home that's going to contribute to the fuel source. From 5 to 30 feet is what's known as the intermediate zone, and we'll talk more about what we can be doing in the intermediate zone. And then from 30 to 100 feet is what's known as the extended zone. And we'll talk about modifications in the extended zone. So really the purposes of the home ignition zone is for you to identify what you can be doing to modify, reduce fuel load, and create fuel breaks. So as I mentioned, that first zone, the immediate zone, you really don't want anything in there that's going to be flammable. You want non-combustible materials all the way around the perimeter of the home for 0 to 5 feet out. This next zone, the intermediate zone, you're going to want to consider designing and spacing, clear away vegetation. If you've got lawn in that area or native grasses, you want to keep them mowed to 4 inches or lower so that they don't conduct the fire and convey it back to more flammable materials. Here's a little diagram you can see of those 3 zones in the home ignition zone, and I'm going to bring those up a little larger so we can take a closer look. So here's that first 5 feet from the home. You shouldn't have any plant material within that area, no wood bark mulch, nothing that's going to be flammable. From the 5 to 30 foot range, if you're going to do plantings, what you want to do for plantings is you want to have them in clumps, and you want to have small clusters of plant material that are spaced apart. What you don't want is a continuous grouping of plant material. If you have trees in this area, your tree tops, the furthest, the drip line of the trees or the tree tops should be 18 feet apart from one another from cluster or grouping to cluster, as you can see designated here. As you get further out into that 30 to 60 foot area, you can have the clusters or groupings a little bit closer together and down to 12 feet. And then from the 60 to 100 feet area, you can have those groupings even a little bit closer where they're just 6 feet apart. But you want that to be a gradual decrease from grouping to grouping as you go further out away from the home. Other things to consider in the intermediate zone between 5 and 30 feet out away from the home. Not only do you want to be thinking about the groupings, but you want to be thinking about the height and the width of the plant material that you're choosing to put in there. So the horizontal spacing, if you've got a cluster or grouping of shrubs, really you want to be giving space in between those shrubs so that if you have a 3 foot wide shrub, you ideally are going to take out anything that's going to create that continuous fuel source and space it out. So a 3 foot wide shrub should be 6 foot from the next shrub ideally, so that if in fact it does light on fire or catch fire, that it won't convey flames to the next shrub right away, or at least it will slow down the spread of the fire. If you're limbing up trees or pruning in the landscape in your home ignition zone, ideally you want to remove any plant material from right below taller trees. Ideally, you're limbing up 3 times the height of what's beneath it. So for example, if this is 3 feet, 6 feet, and this is up to 9 feet, you want to limb up the tree all the way up to the top of that 9 foot there and take those branches out. Here's an example of a tree that could use some limbing up. You can even go and in these types of areas, there's a general rule of thumb, if you don't have plant material on there, is to limit up at least 10 feet above the ground in order to reduce what's known as ladder fuels. Also be aware of any grasses that are down below the tree limbs and try and keep those mowed to 4 inches or less. Here's an example of, again, on the left, and then on the right, this is an example of a tree that's been limbed up. You can see that's several feet off the ground. I want to go back to the term ladder fuels in case you're not aware of what that means. And ladder fuels are going to be fuels that are going to help convey a surface fire and potentially lead to a crown fire. And crown fires are going to be ones that are going to be higher up in the canopy of the trees, and they're much more difficult to manage and control. So by removing the in-between fuel sources, you can prevent that from happening, or at least slow down the intensity and spread of that fire. So thinking about the existing fuel arrangement on your property could be important, and you want to make sure that you don't have these trees that are in between, or small shrubs or smaller trees. Here's an example of a potential fuel ladder. You can see some smaller plants underneath here. If you were to have a fire, it would just crawl right up and potentially spread to become a crown fire. Here's an example. This is an example from the Bend area. This was part of the Skeleton Fire, which was a wildfire that went through the south part of Bend in Deschutes County in 1996. And this home was part of that wildfire in that area. And what happened is they had a hill hedge here of ornamental juniper. Ornamental juniper are flammable plants, and they can really sustain and throw some serious flames and heat. So they had your typical shrub border up against the home that you see with a lot of homes. And an ember came in and hit one of the ornamental juniper. And because of the arrangement, there were several of the plants all together in a row. And because of the proximity of the home, what happened is you had a perfect fuel ladder there, and it was able to convey the home. And the fire continued up and started to burn part of the home. The only reason that this home survived this wildfire was because the fire personnel were on site and were able to put it out. I want to mention just briefly topography. This was part of the fire behavior triangle, and you can't really modify topography, but I just want you to be aware of the differences in topography and how that affects how you should be modifying the plants that are existing in your landscape if you're going to be cleaning up or modifying the fuel source. So on flat ground, when you have a fire going, the heat and the smoke plume are going to go straight up in the air. But if you happen to live on a slope, you want to be aware of that, especially the downslope. You're going to see that this fire is going to preheat anything upslope. And so that preheating will actually cause these other plants to catch on fire more quickly or sooner. And so you want to be aware of that, and you want to be thinning out downslope from your home or structure in particular, in addition to around it. And here's an example of a homeowner that did just that. You can see there's a gradual slope here just to clean up and thin out around that area, and then create this fuel break right here with rocks and gravel, really keeping it clean from any type of combustibles. And then this homeowner could go back in and do some low growing ground covers or fire resistant plant material in through here to add to that fuel break. And if you happen to live on a slope, there's lots of information available. I just threw this in there so you have an idea of, as the slope increases, you should be looking to modify and remove fuel further and further out away from the home. And although I'm not going to be talking about materials, I do just want to mention, if you have a porch, a raised porch, that you want to make sure that you're screening so that embers don't fly underneath the decking material, especially if your decking material is not fire resistant. Something like this, where you just have this lattice work, embers would be able to get through there, or sparks. So you'd want something more substantial than this to keep out any embers or sparks. Does modifying around the home, within the home ignition zone work? Yep, it can work successfully. This is a good example of that. This is from the skeleton fire again in Southeast Bend. The way that this fire moved through, it was coming from the left side of your screen and went off to the right side of the screen. There was another home's garage completely burned down, and another home was severely burned. But the fire actually went around this home, in part because of the fuel break they had created with the turf grass. And the ponderosa pine that were there were actually able to shield some of that. You can see that they were scorched and burned, but they actually helped keep some of that heat away from the home. And so the fire went around this home in this particular case because of the fuel break they'd created. This photo was taken, I think, about 7 or 8 years after. It's the same home. You can see they added a garage since, but I like to show this photo. It's interesting. Go back here and you can see that these ponderosa pine were scorched or burned in the fire, but they have the ability to withstand some of that heat. And so it wasn't completely and outright killed. You can see how some of these pines came back over time. So for our purposes of talking about fire resistance, there's a couple of different definitions floating around out there. There's the term fire resistance from an ecological standpoint, and that is the ability to persist in a plant community after a wildfire has gone through. An example of that would be this tan oak, meaning plants or seed sources that survive a wildfire and then come back following that. But for our purposes, what we're talking about is more about the ability to resist ignition or not sustain continued combustion. So that's what we're referring to when we're talking about fire resistant plant material. Let's talk about some characteristics of highly flammable plants so you know what to look for. Any type of plant that's going to contain fine, dead, or dry material within it, meaning it's going to hold some of the needles that it may slough off during a season, or it's going to hang on to its deciduous leaves late into the season so that you've got some dry, dead material. Anything like that's going to be something you want to avoid planting in the landscape. If you've got leaves, twigs, or stems that have oils, terpenes, or volatile waxes in them, those are also going to be highly flammable and contribute to the fuel source. Aromatic leaves are a good cue that has a strong odor to it, probably an indication that it's high in oils or terpenes. And if you know the sap to be resinous or gummy, again, having a strong odor, all of those can be cues like you would expect from a pine tree. Some of your other conifers, like spruce, are going to be plants that are going to be more flammable and ones to avoid planting, particularly in close to the home. You'll want to move those out if you're going to use any of those much further out into that extended zone area. And if plants have loose or papery bark, there are several deciduous plants that the part of their characteristic is to have exfoliating bark or peeling bark, and that would contribute to the fuel source as well. Some of the birches do that. Here's your traditional, this is an ornamental juniper shrub border, and you can see it looks green from the outside, but if you were to take away the exterior, you would see the inside just contains lots and lots of dead needles that have sloughed off through the years. And so if this was to catch fire, juniper in particular has two things that aren't, you're going to have some that aromatic foliage, you're going to have some volatile waxes and flammable characteristics in that way. And then you also have this accumulation of dead and dying material. Here's a list of some of the ones, more common plants you may see here in Central Oregon, some of which are ornamental and some are native that you would want to avoid putting in the landscape. And the ornamental juniper I mentioned, mugo pines, really any of the pine trees are going to contribute to the fuel source. So you want to avoid pine trees. Ceanothus, that's the buckbrush we have here. Bitterbrush, sagebrush, manzanita, our native Western juniper, arborvitae, and also spruce is going to be another one you want to avoid putting anywhere near your home or structure. Those types of plants, for example, this mugo pine on the right, when they catch fire, they're going to be completely consumed. They're going to sustain burn for a long time, and they're going to convey pretty high flames that are going to potentially lead to other things catching on fire. You also want to make sure that you're clearing anything away from the home that's going to be touching the roof line. Now, looking at the characteristics of fire-resistant plants, the types of characteristics you're going to want to look for, a lot of your deciduous plant material and trees and shrubs are going to be considered fire-resistant. These are going to be plants that have moist or supple leaves that can be easily crushed. You can take, for example, a maple leaf and kind of crush it up in your hand easily without it crumbling. That's going to be a sign there's more moisture to that plant. Trees that are going to be clean, they're not going to collect debris when the leaves come off. The leaves are going to be sloughed away and not stay on the plant or in the plant. You want to make sure some plants have the tendency or characteristics where they may have dead wood accumulate over time. You want to make sure you're not planting anything that's going to do that. And in particular with shrubs, since a lot of the shrubs fall into the category of being a ladder fuel, you're going to want to make sure, again, they're not collecting that dead wood, dying wood, or debris over time. And make sure that there's no strong odors coming from the plant. The goal when having a FireWise landscape is really to try and break up the fuel ladders, remove them, and create a fuel break, at least to modify it enough so that there would be time in the case of a wildfire for fire personnel to get there and help protect the home. If plants are well maintained, and you can see I have that bolded and underlined, they have the ability to slow down a fire, prevent the flames from going too high, and reduce the amount of heat being conveyed to the home or structure. And so ideally, if you're going to use fire resistant plants around the home, you want to make sure they're well maintained. If they're not in good shape, then all of a sudden a fire resistant plant becomes less fire resistant because it has some accumulated dead wood or broken branches that were never pruned off. Or if it's a perennial plant, for example, maybe the perennial plant went dormant and you never pruned back that the following spring or that fall, and you've got some dry dead material now in that perennial plant. So I can't emphasize enough, the condition of the plant is really important, because even a fire resistant plant is going to burn, but it needs to be in a healthy state in order to be most effective as a fire resistant plant. And that means taking good care of it, sufficient irrigation, keeping it disease and insect free so you don't have dieback on the branches of trees and shrubs. So does it work to put fire resistant plants? Well, here's a good case study from the Aubrey Butte fire that occurred in Bend in 2007. So this wildfire started, there was a construction crew doing some work here and cutting through rebar, and there's some sparks started to fly, and one of the sparks caught some of the native plant material on fire. So that fire started to run uphill with the native plant material, and then it ran into some ornamental plantings around this home, and it just kind of exploded from there. The ornamental plant material in particular was highly flammable, and so you can see that the flames get pretty large here. Then the direction of the wind helped facilitate the spread and intensity of the fire, and it started to move to the right of the home and continue around the homes on this upper part of the slope. So let's take a closer look at what happened once the fire was out. You can see here on the left of the screen, these are going to be mugo pines that were consumed by the wildfire. Mugo pines, highly flammable, and there were some native plants in front of these mugos that conveyed the fire to the mugos. But once they caught fire, then there was a lot of heat going towards this home. Also some spruces, that's what you're seeing where my cursor is right here. Those are some spruces that caught fire and were consumed. If you take a closer look, you can see on the home, the paint is starting to bubble here on the home as a result of the heat. Again, just you can see the scorching on the home here and some of the paint coming off. Just another view of that same home. Here's another home in the same area, and you can see they've got some different plant material in front of their homes. Let's take a closer look at that. This is actually some native plants here that were consumed by the wildfire. You can see some pines. And then as we get closer to the home, there's a whole border here of willow. And this was the direction the wildfire was kind of racing up towards this home, which is to the right of the other one we saw. So if you get up close, you can see the fire actually did make it all the way up to these willow. and the willows were scorched from the wildfire, but because they have moisture in their leaves and they're considered a fire resistant plant, they were actually able to help slow down the fire and act as a somewhat of a barrier as they absorbed the heat and burned more slowly. And so you can see here right behind in the background is mugo pines. Thank goodness the willows were in front of the mugo pines, because the willows were able to stop it. If it would have hit those mugo pines, it would have been a different scenario for that home behind there. And so it'd be a good idea probably going forward to take something like these mugo pines out. Here's another view of the first home that I showed you, and these are aspen. And you can see the aspen also got scorched from the wildfire, but the aspen were able again to kind of protect the home by absorbing the heat and the flames. Again, aspen would be considered a fire resistant type of plant based on its characteristics. So there's those mugo pines. They were throwing heat to the aspen, but the aspen was able to slow down that wildfire. Here's a good example of, this is a retired fire chief. It's not somebody I know. These pictures weren't taken by me, but he put in a FireWise landscape, and just to show you. So you've got just really low growing. You've got some rocks and boulders here. You don't have anything planted up close against the home. There's some space between the deck and this planting. And so real low growing, something that's not going to convey fire to the home if it was to catch on fire. Of course, there's a large fuel break with turf grass, and turf grass contains a lot of moisture in the leaf material. So it does work well as a fuel break as far as breaking up wildfire. Oops. And this is a little further out. You can see you get past that intermediate zone into the extended zone, and you've got some of the native plant material. But this is just one example of a more FireWise landscape. Additionally, the housing materials were built with non-combustible roofing and siding and windows, I believe, as well. Here's another view. This homeowner also chose to put in a pond so that there would be a water source in case of a wildfire. Something else you could think about adding depending on the size of your property and where you're located. And then this is another view from that same home, and you can just see how the forest, the outer edge of here has been thinned and also limbed up. Grasses are kept low. So if you're going through a checklist of what can I be doing now for this upcoming wildfire season, you want to go through and remove any weeds, keep your grasses down low, replace any flammable mulching type materials to non-combustibles using gravel or rock. You can clear the roof and deck and gutters from pine needles, debris, and any excessive debris around the home that has the potential to be combustible. Some resources that are available when it comes to looking for fire resistant plants is going to be, there is a fire resistant plant catalog that was put out. We put this out in 2006, I believe. And so we're actually in the process of updating the guide. There's some parts and pieces of it that are dated at this point. It's available online. You can access it in the internet. And we also have some hard copies in the office at the OSU Extension office. If you are interested in picking up a guide, you can do that. And it's a pictorial plant guide. We've got images and some plant descriptions in the guide, and we have perennials, trees, and shrubs in there. But as I mentioned, we're actually in the process of updating the guide, and our plan is to have it out this season. If you're wanting to look for some other fire resistant plant lists, you can get online and do a search on Google. But what I would suggest is that if you put in fire resistant plants, for example, that you finish your search type with the word site, : and edu, and that's going to bring up university-based websites where you're going to see research-based information. One of the other guides I'd like to use is a guide that was put out by Idaho Firewise, and here's the website link for that one. And they did some testing on ornamental plant material, probably the most extensive testing I've seen, or at least that I'm aware of. And just to give you an idea of what's inside that guide, they did some testing looking at mineral content and moisture content, those two being making a plant more fire resistant, the more moisture or mineral content it has. And then they also looked at the oil content and the height and the width of the plant. And they went through these plants and were able to give them a fire resistance score. And as you can see, here's the home up here, and they divided the scores into 3 different zones. And then they list the plants out by where you should put this plant if you're going to in the zone. So it's an interesting list. They actually went into a lot of different cultivars of different ornamental plants, and native plants are listed here as well for that region, which there's crossover here into Central Oregon. So that might be a nice guide for you to look at. I'll just put this back here for a minute so you can write down that website, or I can even put that in the Q&A at the end if I need to. So now we're going to take a look. Just a comment about fire resistant plants. The guide that I helped co-author several years ago, we have had a lot of feedback from individuals wanting more plants to be added to that guide. Now, the only plants we put in that guide were plants that we could find research on related to fire resistance. And the reality is there's very, very little research on fire resistant plants and how they've been tested, particularly with ornamental plant material. That type of research is very costly and expensive, which is probably part of the reason there hasn't been a lot of research to date on ornamental plants in particular. That you need a lot of special equipment to do the research, and we just haven't seen a lot of studies done on fire resistance in plants. There's challenges that way with the expense and how to do the research. There's also challenges in that a plant that is fire resistant in location A isn't necessarily going to be as fire resistant in location B, because you have different soil types, you have different elevations, and all of those are going to impact moisture content. For example, you may have the 2 exact same plants, but the moisture content will be different because of the way soil holds moisture and the way the plant can access that moisture. And so there's a lot of different variables that affect fire resistance and what can be labeled as fire resistant consistently across the board. So now what I'd like to do is just go through some plants that work well here in Central Oregon. When you're selecting fire resistant plant material, you want to look for plants that are either native or non-native. If you're going to choose non-native plants that are fire resistant, you just want to make sure they're non-invasive to the area. So I'm going to start out with the lowest growing plants called ground covers, work through some perennials and then shrubs and then trees. And the idea is just to give you a little sample here of some of the plants that are fire resistant that can work well here in Central Oregon. When you're planting out your plants that are fire resistant, normal planting practices would be to put 1/3 amendment, like a fine, nice compost, to 2/3 native soil for any ornamental plant material. If you're planting native plants, you won't need to add any amendment. You can just plant it in the native soil. So here's Snow in Summer. This is a common ground cover. It has kind of a silvery gray foliage to it. It likes full sun, and this is what it looks like when it's in bloom. It can do a fair amount of spreading, so it would be one that you would have to be modifying and probably removing it if you're going to try and maintain those clumps as I talked about. It's not an extremely aggressive ground cover compared to some others, but it will start to spread and fill in, so you will need to modify it as you go. Very drought tolerant. There's a close up of the blossom. Another low growing ground cover, a real common one, is creeping phlox. Comes in a variety of colors, and that's going to be the one that's flowering pink here. There's 3 clusters of that. And this one can do pretty well. If you aren't maintaining this one, you may see a little bit of accumulation of dry material or dry matter. And so you'll want to make sure you're pruning this one back and letting it come back each season. There's a close-up of the creeping phlox. And just one of the varieties. This one is called Candy Stripe. They also come in purplish blues and whites. Sedum is a great ground cover, and there's lots of different types of sedum. Here are 2 side by side. You can see they can do really well in rock or gravel. They prefer full sun, and they've got different types of foliage. This one has a variegated foliage, green with kind of yellow marginal edges. A yellow flower on that one. And then this one has kind of a bronzy reddish appearance to the leaf or foliage color during the summer. Very drought tolerant, lots of moisture in the leaves, probably one of your best choices for fire resistant plantings. And there's another type of sedum in full bloom. Lots and lots of choices with sedum as ground covers. Delosperma is known as ice plant, is another good choice for a ground cover. This is not to be confused. There's an ice plant well known in California that's considered invasive. It's a different genus, not the same plant. Delospermas are going to be a really good choice for Central Oregon. This one's called Mesa Verde is the variety of ice plant. You can see a close up, really pretty pinkish kind of coral colored flowers. There's hardy yellow ice plant. You can see the planting environment. They're really pretty tough. And this is purple ice plant, but there's lots of different colors. There's reds and oranges and yellows and whites. Any of the penstemon are going to be a good choice. We have a lot of native penstemon in Central Oregon you could be planting, but we also have the pine leaf penstemon, which is the one that's got this kind of reddish orange bloom on it. They like full sun. The pine leaf penstemon, the reason why it's one of my favorites is because it has a really long bloom time on it compared to other perennials. You can usually get about 6 weeks of bloom on this one versus just a couple of weeks. And again, you've got some different color of pine leaf penstemon you can choose from. This is Richardson's penstemon. That's going to be one of our native penstemon, the purplish blooming one here. There's a close-up of the bloom on that one. Again, full sun. Yarrow is another option for fire-resistant perennials, and they come in a variety of different colors as well, in addition to our native yarrow. This one you might have to keep an eye on. The cultivated ones aren't going to spread the way the native one does, so I would recommend a cultivated variety. There are those that will just kind of stay in a cluster versus spreading by rhizomes, which is what you can see sometimes with certain varieties of yarrow. And again, you want to make sure you're not giving that continuous amount of plant material. You want to break that up. So you will have to keep an eye on it if you choose to use yarrow. Blue flax is one of our native plants. And this one also likes full sun. Sun rose is another common perennial, comes in a variety of different colors, likes full sun. Daylilies, any of the daylilies would work for fire resistant plants or could be used in those groupings. And red hot poker is a taller perennial if you're looking for a little bit of height. Again, you don't want to put this where it would be considered a ladder fuel, but you could do it in a small grouping of perennials. There's a close-up of the blossom on that one. Full sun plant. Yucca, there's a couple different types of yucca you can plant in Central Oregon. Moving on to shrubs. We don't have a lot of Daphne that work well here, but Carol Mackey is one of those that you could potentially plant. That's what it looks like close up. You've got the variegated leaf, real fragrant blossom on this one. A little bit tougher to get going here. It definitely needs to have moderate water use if you're going to plant this one. The common lilacs can work as a taller shrub if you're looking for a taller shrub out beyond that immediate zone in the home ignition zone. You can put it in the intermediate zone, or you'd be putting it in the extended zone. Any of the French hybrid lilacs work well. There's some examples of those. They stay a little bit smaller than the common lilac. Mock orange was one of the ones that got a pretty high fire resistant rating score from that Idaho research. This is Lewis's mock orange, which is one of our native mock orange. There's also some cultivated varieties of mock orange. Extremely fragrant. Pollinators love this plant. It's a nice choice. Red twig dogwood or Rhodosiae dogwood. It's a native, full sun to part shade. There's the fruit on that. And then you've got the really nice, interesting bark or texture during the winter months. Western spirea is another native that can be used in your Firewise landscape. This one blooms later in the season. Get these kind of fuzzy pink blossoms on it. And a yellow fall color to that one. So this is a good example. You can see this is the spent flower. If this was me, I'd be going out and I'd be pruning off the spent flowers. You can just go ahead and prune back on this plant. Moving on to trees or something taller, probably one of the best deciduous trees, if you're going to plant one in the landscape, is going to be the red maple or red maple hybrids. Those are going to be a nice choice. Some of the other ones that you could plant, what's nice about the red maple, of course, is you get excellent fall color with those. They do need supplemental irrigation here. You're not going to be able to just stick them in the ground, but just going to be a good choice for you. And there's some other maples that can also be planted, like a moor or flame maple is more a multi-stem shrub. Tatarian maple, vine maple, all of those can be used. Aspen, if you have the room for them, just remember that aspen are genetically, characteristically, they're going to create groves. So if you're planting aspen, just make sure you have the room for them. And again, you don't really want necessarily a continuous spectrum of plant material. So you'll just want to be thoughtful on where you're putting the aspen if you're going to put them in the ground. But they are fire resistant, as we saw in that Arbor Butte fire example. It's a close-up of the foliage. Here's Swedish aspen, is a cultivar, has a more upright, narrow growth habit. Quaking aspen have yellow fall color, and the Swedish aspen have more of this kind of orange to red, yellow fall color. They both are going to sucker or create groves. Crab apples are one of your other, probably the top two, I would say, are maples and crab apples as far as fire resistant plant trees that are deciduous. This is spring snow. It's a sterile variety, meaning it doesn't set fruit. It's an excellent specimen we have here that can work well in Central Oregon. Again, the pollinators love it as well. So serves a couple different purposes. There's a close-up of the blossoms. Another crab apple. This is a smaller crab apple. It's called Royal Raindrops. It's got real pretty blossoms in spring, and then you kind of have a reddish maroon foliage on this one. Chokecherry. This is going to be our native chokecherry, and this is when it's in full bloom. It's a close-up of that blossom. Real fragrant. And then there's cultivated varieties of chokecherry. This is Schubert. Schubert, it leaves out green, but then it turns maroon during the summer months and keeps that maroon colored foliage. full sun, both of those. European mountain ash, it's another deciduous tree that you could potentially have in your landscape. There's a close-up of what the flower looks like and the fruit set. And serviceberry. Serviceberry, we have native serviceberry shrubs, so you can use any of the serviceberry shrub, and there's cultivated varieties of trees. This is it in bloom. They're blooming right now here in Central Oregon. I see all the serviceberry white flowers. There's what the tree looks like during the summer months. There's a close-up of that blossom, and the flowers turn into a nice fruit. Sometimes serviceberry is also referred to as Juneberry. It's actually, you can make jams or jellies out of the berry if you get to them before the birds do. There's the close-up of the fruit set. And there's fall color on the serviceberry. So I think serviceberry is one of the most underused plants for Central Oregon. We have very little pest issues with it. It's not a real full thick tree as far as being a shade tree, but it has a real nice canopy to it. It doesn't get too large. And there's also the shrub forms that are really nice. So that's just the overview of some of the fire resistant plants you can use in your landscape. I hope that you were able to take home some interesting concepts and ideas about how you can make your landscape more fire wise. I'm going to look at the Q&A now and look at those questions and answer those questions for you. But also want to ask for those of you that are still on to fill out the survey if possible. You can either hold your phone up to the QR code and go to the survey that way, or you can click on the link, and I'll leave this link on, and see if I can put this link maybe in the Q&A as a response. And so let me go to the Q&A. Okay, so first question here is, I have a lot of native grasses close to my home. How far away should they be? Well, you can have the native, I would say you can have the native grasses in that intermediate zone if, which is going to be beyond 5 feet of the home, but you want to make sure they're staying mowed down to 4 inches or less. Maximum would be like 6 inches. So if you have a way to mow them down, that would be okay with a weed whacker or another way. But if you're not going to be able to mow them down, then I would put them out beyond that intermediate zone, and I'd put them into the extended zone. Please discuss the uses bark as a ground cover. Thanks. Wood, when you're saying bark materials, they would not be encouraged to be used as something you would use, especially not in that the first 5 feet of the home. And to be honest, I wouldn't be, if you're in a wildfire prone area or in the wildland urban interface, I would be hesitant to be using wood bark mulch. I would encourage you to use non-combustible mulching materials like gravel or decorative rock. You mentioned no tree bark mulch within 5 feet of your home. Would coconut husk be considered the same? Good question, because coconut husk is becoming more popular. Yes, I would not be using the coconut husk. That too would be something that would be potentially flammable or added to fuel source. So again, if you're going to use something like, if you do decide to use either something like coconut husk or wood bark mulch, make sure you're using it further out away from the home, and it has to stay wet, because it's very easy for a spark or an ember would be able to light either of those materials on fire pretty quickly if they're kept too dry. Are pine cones and pine needles considered ladder fuel? Technically, they're probably not considered a ladder fuel, but they are materials that can contribute to a fuel source. So you want to keep those, you want to remove those from your site if possible, raking those up and getting rid of them. I know we have our upcoming fire-free days at the landfill. So I think that starts next week, or excuse me, I think it starts first weekend in May. But yeah, probably technically not a ladder fuel because of their height, but definitely would contribute to the fuel source. How can one effectively balance native plants, sagebrush, bitterbrush, juniper, and fire resistance? So yeah, unfortunately, none of those three are considered fire resistant. So you're going to have to be managing those if you have those further out in that extended zone, just to be clearing around it and creating, trying to give some space between where those plants are and breaking up the continuum of fuel. Ideally, yeah, so simply remove any of these natives within 30 feet of your home. Ideally, yes. Okay. Any tips on effectively balancing water wise with fire wise? Well, I've been asked this question before, and unfortunately, one doesn't necessarily lend itself to the other. And so there are some fire wise and water wise plants that have both characteristics, like sedum, ice plant. Those ones are both water wise and fire wise. But this is a case where you have to prioritize, and probably for most, the fire wise is going to take priority over the water wise. It's such a tough one because we need to be water wise here as well in our location, and most Western states are looking at trying to be both water wise and fire wise. But really, the two characteristics are exclusive of one another, and there's not really a lot of crossover necessarily. Good questions. Let's see. I think that was the last of the questions. So I am gonna see if I can copy this link into the, into the Q&A here. I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight, and I hope that you were able to, actually another question popped up. In general, Bend has been increasing density with homes as close as 10 feet apart, and evergreens are used to improve privacy among these homes. Are there any evergreens that are better than others in this increased density environment? Yeah, that's really tough because we have a limited plant palette as far as privacy or screening type plant material. There are some things you can use that are deciduous, but then in the winter, you don't have that privacy. Unfortunately, there are no evergreens that are going to be used on the small urban lots here that are going to be fire resistant. Some of the best choices would be upright juniper or arborvitae, and both of those are considered flammable plants. So that's a situation where there's no easy option there. You'd have to go with a deciduous shrub border or privacy screen, and just not have that privacy during the winter months. Okay. Any other questions? And I'm going to try and let's see. I'm going to try and copy this hyperlink and see if I can just put it into, I'm going to put it into that first question there, and it doesn't seem to be copying in for me. Try one more time. And if there are, well, I don't think I'm going to get that. So I think another question popped into the Q&A. Hopefully you can just copy it down from the screen or use your smartphone on the QR code. Okay. We joined late. Is there a YouTube link for this presentation? I believe these are being recorded, so.
Yeah, this is Scott from the control room. So immediately following this event, all three of the presentations will be posted up to the CWNA website.
Great, thank you. Can you put the link to chat to everyone? I can see other people's questions. I'm not sure that we are going to be able to do that with the Q&A. Oh, and let's see. I don't know if you can help me with that or not, but
So if you copy that link, so simply right click it from your presentation, copy the link. You should be able to use the Zoom function and answer the question by typing it, and then everyone will see it.
yeah, I've tried that a couple times now, and it doesn't seem like it's going in for me. I'm copying the link. And when I go to actually answer any of these questions, oh, let's see, let me. Yeah, it's just not showing up. I'm not seeing it, at least on my end, to be able to send it. Let me see if I can just type it in. And then are there any other questions that have come up? I see one here that says, are you in favor of developers clear cutting all of the vegetation when they begin a new development? That question to me has a lot of different levels to it. It would be, I wouldn't necessarily say yay or nay to that until I would know what the development goals are there. So, and where the development is located and all of those things. There's just a lot of variables I would need to know. And that question to me is pretty broad, and there's a lot of different components to answering that. I don't know how to, and then is there a way so people can?
So I've posted the link. So for those that are used to using chat, there's also a section for the Q&A, and that's where these questions are being asked and answered. I've posted the link that is up on the screen right there for the anonymous survey link. And it's under you'll see under Q&A, there's a section for open questions, answered, and dismissed.
So yeah, we don't have as many we only have black bears in the area.
Are there any other questions?
Black bears. And you won't expect to see them as much.
I went ahead and posted it in the chat. We'll leave that open for a minute.
Throughout Oregon, they're very shy.
Thank you, Amy. The other primary presentation they've finished, so they've closed.
Okay.
The other one that has Ariel and oh gosh, I'm sorry,
Thomas.
Yeah, Thomas. They're still running. So if any of you wanted to head over, they're into their Q&A section. But again, all of these will be posted to the CWNA website as soon as possible following this event.
Always be bear aware.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining.
Another question.
Wonderful. We'll wrap up. Again, thank you, Amy Jo. And again, for those that have questions, by all means, you can click on that survey link and or send her an email. We're going to go ahead and close the webinar now. And thank you all for attending.
There's a lot of fidelity